our last session. Our last speaker for the day is David Giles, and he is going to be talking about online discussion forums.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Right, well, the first thing I should say really that actually what I'm going to talk about is slightly different to the talks that you've already had today, which have tended to be involved with research which is very specifically designed in order to collect data for a specific purpose. So it's what we might call researcher-generated data. What I'm going to be talking about largely is what might be referred to as naturally occurring data. So it's data that would exist regardless of whether anyone was conducting any research. So in a sense, that brings about a whole new set of questions which are quite different to some of the ones that we've been looking at so far today. So every now and again I'll kind of skip back to some of those very broad questions, but because I'm talking very specifically about discussion forums, then most of what I say will be very specific in relation to discussion forums. Having said that, discussion forums don't necessarily have to be naturally occurring. You can set your own discussion forums up to do research, and this is often done, for example, in health research, if people want to generate a sort of community for a research purpose. Sometimes these are referred to as online focus groups, but sometimes they also be referred to as discussion forums. What I'm going to be talking about today isn't really that sort of discussion forum. It's more to do with the discussion forums that already exist online that we can look at and do research on. Just a brief kind of history of discussion forums. I mean, these are things which I expect most people in this room will have some experience of anyway, but it often helps just to narrow down the definition of what it exactly is that I'm talking about here. So discussion forum is really a sort of modern day manifestation of the sort of bulletin board type of environment that computer users have communicated via since the 1980s. We had news groups that were organised through something called Usenet, and as I say, bulletin boards, very often things where you signed up via email too. But today, usually we find discussion forums on kind of standalone websites. These are websites which have got their own independent existence of any other kind of host, and have their own forum on. And the format of a discussion forum is quite standard now. You tend to find that they consist of various different threads, where following a specific theme, where people post consecutive messages that we tend to refer to as posts, and usually these are organised in some sort of chronological fashion, which means that you can follow the discussion as it emerges over time. But this, of course, does depend on what site moderators decide to do, and sometimes very imaginative moderators reconstruct threads, or certainly reconstruct forums and so on, sub-forums and all the rest of it. Now we can have a look at one or two forums just to illustrate what I mean by this. But I think one of the things I wanted to point out first of all is that one of the ways of thinking about forums when we go in to do this sort of research is to think about them as communities, or communities of practice, which is where they are communities that consist of members who have come together for a very specific purpose, usually because they have a shared interest or activity, whether that be fandom of a particular fan object, whether that's say a football club or a pop group, or whether it's an identity that they share, such as a parent, or whether they have a particular hobby. Here, for example, now, I haven't actually checked these links, so no guarantee that this will work. But if it does work, it should come to a, yeah, there we go, Tottenham Hotspur fan forum. Oh, I've got it up on here, but it's not showing. Right, okay. Now,
If you Alt-tab, it might get to it.
sorry, Alt
Alt-tab.
tab, right. No, all that does is change my what I can see.
I think it's because you're in tab presentation. I think you're in
Oh, I
display
see.
mode.
Right. So,
I think. I'm just going to close it quickly.
go on then. Yeah.
Close this tab. Where is this? Yeah, there you
Don't worry too much if this doesn't work because it's not
Oh, there we go.
vitally important.
We got it.
go. Yeah, you'll just have to
Okay.
reopen your PowerPoint.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So thanks.
Display mode. Yeah.
So this is the Tottenham Hotspur fan forum, and just to show the sort of structure that we're looking at here, there you have various different sub-forums based on topics, and there you have them organised into threads, and then if you click on a thread there, this is a very long one, starting off in June, so it's organised literally in chronological order. Sometimes they're usually backwards, sometimes they're backwards chronological order. So that's one. So now I'm going to have to go back to...
It's the last one, David.
Oh, that's the last one there, yeah. Well, perhaps if I... oops, that was the wrong thing to click, wasn't it? Oh, no, here we go.
It'll come up. It's just going to sit there. There we go.
It's always ironic, isn't it, when you do a talk about collecting online data and you end up being unable to use the technology. Okay, well, I won't bother going into these other sites, but just as two very different types of forum. Anyone who's familiar with Mumsnet, very much organised around an enormous forum, an extremely active forum where you will have thousands of posts every day on all sorts of different topics in a very large community. And then a much smaller community that I used as a contrast, which was a railway sort of train spotters type forum with very much smaller numbers, much less active, but not in terms of the actual number of posts, but actually the people involved in it were very active. Now, actually, at this point, having described these different forums, I'll just say a little bit about ethics. I don't really want to say a lot about ethics because it's, again, some of the ethics involved in this sort of research are very difficult to navigate through. Broadly speaking, I would say that there's two types of data we might want to collect from an ethical point of view. One is publicly available data in the public domain, which are the sort of things I've been looking at there. So from Tottenham Hotspur fan forum, anyone with an internet connection can look at those threads and access the data. And I would say, generally speaking, in those instances, if we're doing that sort of research, then ethical considerations are more to do with what you're doing with the data than actually whether you can access it, whether you can report it, whether you can quote verbatim from it. The other type of forum is one that would be a members-only forum, so a sort of closed forum where you actually have to become a member of the community in order to access the threads. And there you are really required to do quite a lot of ethical groundwork in order to quote, or certainly to cite from that sort of community, because clearly by making it a closed group, the people who run the forum aren't expecting the general public to be able to just log on and read what's on the website. So that's really all I'm going to say about ethics for now, because generally speaking, I think ethics for this sort of research needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Almost every time you do this study using publicly available forum data, you're putting into our slightly different questions and make slightly different decisions about the data. And sometimes it's really a question of how ethical is your research question as much as anything else. what are you going to do to the data, for example. If you're going to do some sort of psychoanalytic interpretation of people's posts and use this to infer people's state of mind, then it poses slightly different ethical questions from if you're just gathering opinions about a topic. Now, so that's one way of discriminating between two different types of forum. And I'm now going to identify two different types of data that we can collect and two different types of study that we might want to do. And I'm going to illustrate these with really two facets of the same research project that I did on Asperger's disorder and the online Asperger's community. So the first type of data we might collect is what I would call content or thematic types of data. And this is where you're using a forum because you want to find out what people are saying online about a specific substantive topic. Now, this, by substantive topic, I mean by something which kind of predates the internet. However, we might want to see it as socially constructed or as kind of really existing or whatever. So, for example, if you were interested in looking at racist discourse, then you might want to do this by seeing how racist discourse manifests itself in an online environment. Or, for example, if you're doing research on parenting and you wanted to see what parents say about temper tantrums, then one assumes that this is a topic that has a long history that predates the internet. Similarly, eating disorders as a broad category obviously has a long history before the internet came along. So these are what I would call substantive offline topics that we might want to research by looking at how they're talked about in a forum. Now I'm going to contrast those with the sorts of data that we might collect where we're directed very much towards the actual online nature of the interaction. So this is more of a sort of social type of research. And in this type of research, the discussion forum or the online community becomes very much the object of the study, so that we don't make the assumption that the substantive topic is the same thing online as offline. I mean, the example that I've often used in the past is to do with pro-ana. And I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with pro-ana websites, the pro-ana phenomenon, but I'll just give you a very brief outline of the phenomenon. It's essentially around the turn of the century, a lot of websites were set up which were designed really to celebrate anorexia, celebrate extreme thinness, and became very much demonised in the media for having things like tips and tricks, so how to hide your anorexia from your friends and family and so on. And particularly for the nature of the forums where people would effectively, as it was characterised, glamorise anorexia. Now, of course, there was an awful lot of very mundane talk as well on these websites, as well as the more spectacular stuff that made it into the news media. But there was a big controversy around it in around 2001, 2002, and a number of web hosts immediately closed the standalone websites that they were hosting to do with pro-ana. And what's happened in the intervening period is that, firstly, there was a wave of communities that came about as a reaction to the closing down of the initial pro-ana sites, which tended to kind of rebrand themselves as things like post-pro-ana. And then there's been a sort of third generation of pro-ana, which is really its manifestation in social media. So if you want to find pro-ana now, places to look for it would be Instagram and Pinterest and places like that. But of course, one of the things that a lot of the research in this area has made the assumption, and I don't really want to kind of caricature it as kind of health research, but a lot of it is health, clinical research and so on, has tended to assume that there is a kind of an invariant phenomenon known as the pro-ana website, and that in a sense the pro-ana phenomenon hasn't really changed much, and may even predate the internet. But I think if you're taking the second perspective on online communities here, which is to see them very much as the objects of study, I think we have to see pro-ana as something that is unique to the internet and is uniquely, more or less, 21st century. It's certainly not anorexia online, as in one or two studies I've seen that effectively claim that. So what I'm going to do is, as I say, I'm going to talk through one or two of the studies I've done where I'm looking at, I've used the same online community for these two different purposes. So the first of these was a study I published a couple of years ago, which was looking at the Asperger's online community in relation to the DSM-5, and I'll give you a little bit of background to that in a moment. So DSM-5, for those of you who are not familiar with clinical psychiatry or clinical psychology, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, enormously influential publication, sometimes seen as the Bible of psychiatry, and the main thing that it does is that it serves as a source for psychiatrists and many other people in the health professions to use as a way of diagnosing psychiatric disorders. So effectively, the DSM tells us what things we can and can't, tells doctors what things we can and can't diagnose. And one of the things that appeared in the fourth edition of the DSM in 1994 was Asperger's disorder. For the first time, it was recognised as a psychiatric category. But when the DSM was revised in 2013, it was a radical restructuring of quite a few of the different categories of mental disorder, and one of those was autism, which was, I think most people probably know, has been expanded into something called the autism spectrum, so that Asperger's disorder, which once was seen as a separate and, although related, condition, is now seen as as just one thing that's been absorbed by the autism spectrum. So technically speaking, a psychiatrist, health team perhaps, couldn't diagnose Asperger's disorder now because it would be seen as a subset of the autism spectrum. So I was interested to see what sort of ramifications this would have for the online community, which has emerged or had emerged around Asperger's disorder. So these were groups of people who identified as Aspies, which is the common identity term for someone with Asperger's disorder, whether they were diagnosed or not. In a sense, what DSM-5 threatened to do when it came along in 2013 was to remove that identity from them because it was saying effectively that Asperger's no longer had any kind of clinical credibility. So I wanted to see how the online community felt about this. So it was essentially an offline issue, because although the DSM has online sort of online presence, as it were, it's a historical thing, and what was going on within the DSM we can see as something that is historical in nature. But I was specifically looking at the online community to see how they responded to it. So how I did this was I identified a number of websites that I felt represented the online community, although they are really quite different in some respects. But they were effectively all communities put together by people with or claiming to have Asperger's disorder. And then I searched through each forum to identify threads which contained the term DSM. During the period of 2010 to 2012, which was a period when the changes to the DSM were being proposed and circulated quite widely online. and from about 5 different forums, I came up with about 19 threads. So I came up with 19 threads, which was sounds like quite a small number, but of course one of the challenges of doing this sort of research is that a single thread, in many cases, consists of one single post that nobody ever responded to, but in other cases can stretch to thousands of posts, depending on the forum, depending on the community, depending on how popular the topic has been. So that 19 will contain some very long threads, but it also contains 1 or 2 short ones. Then treating this as content data to be analysed for a very specific purpose, I coded each post in terms of the position it took on the proposed changes. So some of these posts were quite positive towards it, and some were very negative, and others were more ambivalent. And generally speaking, the ones that were pro were kind of accepting as much as anything, and sometimes were in favour of it. For example, there was one argument that Asperger's disorder was no longer needed because it had already served its purpose, it had established the community as credible, and we can move on from there and kind of embrace new thinking around the disorder. And there was also quite a common positive frame, which was simply that actually it was discriminating or discriminatory to talk about some people with or people with plain old autism as low functioning and people with Asperger's as high functioning, and that it was better to think of it as a continuum, and it was at least an outdated distinction. Then there were a number of different positions in opposition to that. Some people were frightened because they felt that it would by losing their diagnosis, they felt that they might lose their diagnosis if they were now assessed as having autism spectrum disorder, and that this might cause a material loss in terms of benefits that they received. Some rejected the changes on either scientific grounds or, in fact, some went so far to say the whole of psychiatry was unscientific, and that was enough to reject it. Some posts were simply defiant, saying that, well, it doesn't matter what they say, because the ASPI culture will go on, so who cares about the DSM? And others felt that there were kind of political or economic reasons for the changes, that it was a way of reducing the number of people who receive benefits and so on. Then there were ambivalent posts. In some cases, these were people saying, well, yeah, okay, but don't worry, it won't really affect it. It basically, in a sense, they were kind of talking down the changes, saying that it wouldn't really have much impact. Others saying that don't worry, because although the name will change, the community will remain the same. Just as a by-the-by, really, there was a number of studies have actually kind of supported the idea that there would be fewer people diagnosed under the new criteria, but I haven't as yet found any recent studies that have confirmed these in terms of actual diagnosis. But before I wanted to come on to the second type of data, I want to raise a few limitations of this sort of approach to research. And the first of those is that by taking, although I was identifying threads in the first place and coding those the posts into threads, there's always a danger by taking posts out of threads and looking at them as a sort of a corpus, then you lose the context in which the statements are made. And that's, I think, quite an important limitation of this sort of research. There's another, perhaps equally valid limitation, which is in terms of comparisons, if you're talking about an online community that is spread across several different sites, several different forums, how homogeneous are those forums? Actually identifying the community is a big challenge. And this has certainly happened in pro-ana research, where researchers often made a very clear distinction between pro-ana sites and recovery sites, which have a goal or an agenda that is set towards recovering from eating disorder. And yet, in actual fact, you find that the online community is much muddier than that, and that there are several pro-ana sites with recovery forums in them, and vice versa. So that's also a limitation. If we want to study certain communities within that, some of them are actually unique communities as such, and I'll talk about one in a moment called Wrong Planet. But also, I suppose you could say as an extension of that limitation, is what somebody raised after Deborah and Helen's talk earlier, which is about the literacy issue. And of course, what how far can you generalise things that you found in online forums to the population as a whole? You've always got that limitation as well to bear in mind. And that kind of brings me to the second type of data, because this is where the online presentation of these things becomes, in a sense, what you're interested in as much as the substantive topic. And I suppose this is close to the sort of research that I normally do, which is where I'm particularly interested in the way that interaction takes place in the online environment. And here, the unit of analysis itself becomes the thread. What's going on within the thread? What sort of internal dynamics are there? And often it's tempting to use things like conversation analysis to look at this sort of data, because, of course, discussions do share quite a lot of characteristics of conversation. They comprise an interactional sequence, there's turn-taking, actually very clear turn-taking, but at the same time there's some important differences, and I'm part of an international network of researchers which actually spends a lot of our time looking at these sorts of things. We call them MOOD, which stands for microanalysis of online data. And we're particularly interested in some of the challenges that online data have for techniques like conversation analysis. For example, what we're looking at is not talk, but asynchronous communication, written communication. The sequences don't quite follow the same patterns as offline talk, especially in a very active community like Mumsnet, where posts are flying in at such a rate that sometimes you have to kind of extract the chronological sequence of people's arguments, because they're not really exactly in consecutive order. Also, who are people talking to when they post to a forum? Are they talking to the previous people who've posted on the thread, or are they talking to the entire forum, the entire community? This isn't always clear, and so you have to analyse the addressivity, as it's known, of each post to find out who they're actually addressing. And the other thing, of course, which makes forum threads very interesting is the fact that they're kind of not time-bound. And a lot of the work that's been done in conversation analysis, particularly in terms of things like phone calls, very much time-bound to the closing and opening of the conversation, which may only be a few minutes, whereas forum threads can take months or years even. So, of course, conversation analysis, pure and simple, is limited. It's really a question of using certain techniques from it. Now, I appreciate that I'm probably not going to have time to go through all my analyses of a long argument that took place on Wrong Planet. I think probably I might do better to just end with a few general issues around doing this sort of research in terms of big threads. But some of the things you might look at if you're interested in online forums as communities rather than just as a source of tapping opinion. First thing is to do with the kind of, in a sense, the unique interactional culture of the forum. So how do communities establish norms? What are their values? And these things can only really be teased out by looking at the way in which people interact within specific threads. For example, if somebody posts a message and says, "Hi, I'm new to the forum, I'm a newbie," the term for someone who's new to the community, and then they ask a question of the people on the forum, where we're assuming that they're addressing the whole forum and they're looking for advice. But not always, and sometimes you have to look at the threads in detail to tease this out. There's a very specific phenomenon related to online forums, which is the opening post, and that is the first post that starts a thread. If you look at Mumsnet, for example, it's so important, the opening post, that at every page of the thread, even if it's 1,000 pages, even if there are 1,000 posts in it, and it runs to about 30 odd pages, at the top of every page you'll find the opening post. It's a way of keeping participants on topic so that they know what they're responding to, that they don't diverge too much. And one of the interesting things about the opening post is that it doesn't always steer the topic of the conversation, especially in forums that aren't organised like Mumsnet. And sometimes people can go off in quite a different tangent because it's of more interest to them than the actual opening post. And sometimes the person who posts the initial question doesn't always respond to the advice. In fact, you have to question whether they're actually seeking advice at all. There may be some other kind of social function that posting the first message has. How's the forum moderated? And this is an important issue. Sometimes moderators step in to control forums because they don't like the direction they're steering towards. Sometimes they step in to stop what might be seen as bullying. And sometimes moderators are very, very hands-off and allow all sorts of nasty stuff to go on. But the moderators may be important if you want to look at the way in which the community bonds together, and that sometimes the moderators may well be the ones who do establish the norms. Sometimes they're turned on by the community itself. Sometimes it's not a good relationship, even in a successful forum. Now, one of the things with long threads is that sometimes you need a way of navigating your way through them. If there are 1,000 posts, how do you analyse 1,000 posts? The answer is probably either you'd be better off doing the sort of thematic approach that I talked about earlier, or you analyse chunks of it, or you perhaps track certain individuals even who are posting on it to see what sort of conversation they're having as part of the post, as part of the thread. Alternatively, you might want to look at specific arguments as they're evolving through the thread, which you could do using, say, keywords, search terms or whatever, if the forum allows you to search for things, and sometimes it does. You can search within a thread for specific words, so you might want to use a particular word you think, or a set of terms that you think will be useful. But then that makes it a little bit more thematic if you do that. But then you might want to ask a very broad question: what's happening in this thread? In the sense, this is really from a sort of interactional dynamic perspective. You know, if there's some interesting group dynamics going on here, you might want to ask what they are. How is the thread resolved? If it's a debate, you know, what side does the community come down on, and how is that used in order to enforce the norms of the community? And the other thing you might say, if it's a long thread, why is it successful? why are some threads very short and others very long? And this might be particularly useful if you're looking at online forums as kind of in terms of serving a kind of community purpose, where you want to know what sort of things get people actually contributing, and why do certain opening posts never get responded to. Sometimes threads are ended by moderators. Other times they just die out naturally over time because people have run out of things to say, or they've moved on to other threads. Now, as I say, the example I had here was a very long one, and I'm just going to give you a brief taster of it for the 1 minute.
About 2 minutes.
I've got 2 minutes, right? Okay. Okay, I'll just tell you very quickly what I was looking at here. This was an argument that took place on the DS when I was researching the DSM-5 topic, and I looked at 90 posts that had been a thread of 90 posts, in which one of the community members was attacking the proposals in the DSM-5 to change Asperger's to autism spectrum, and this then led to a very long. Well, I'll kind of skip on to the next. Oops. So then we looked at the first few posts, discussed the DSM and discussed the opening post's recommendations. And then post number 9, in comes someone called Mr. X, who questioned the proposed criteria myself for a while, but now I believe we need to give it a chance. I really believe now this is all much ado about nothing. And then this then led to a long debate with him and the person who gave the opening post, till it got to quite a nasty stage, and it all hinged upon the fact that the person who posted the original post wasn't actually said that he wasn't actually diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, and Mr. X saying, well, you need to get a diagnosis. You are not a valid member of the community unless you have a diagnosis. You don't have a right to say these things. And accused him of bullying the other members. It's a very interesting thread, but unfortunately I don't have time to tell you more about it. But take my word for it, it was quite interesting. So I think that at that point I'll ask if anyone's got any questions really about forum research.